Dearest listeners, there exists no force more dangerous than a gentleman who believes he has nothing left to lose save his honor. If you find this tale compelling, I do hope you might show your appreciation with a like and subscribe to hear more chronicles from your humble narrator. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most harrowing tale of vengeance, transformed by love, that ever graced the drawing rooms of London. A marquis bent on destruction, an innocent bride caught in his web, and a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of two families. But let us not rush through such delicate matters, for the best stories, like the finest claret, must be savored with proper attention to every nuance. The season of 1815 brought with it the usual parade of debutantes, ambitious mamas, and fortune hunters, but it also marked the return of Lord Evander Stirling, the Marquis of Northridge, to London society after an absence of nearly 5 years. Those who remembered him from his youth remarked upon the change in his countenance. Where once had resided the easy charm and open manner of a young nobleman secure in his place, there now existed only a cold precision of movement and a gaze that seemed to calculate the worth of every soul it encountered. The transformation had not occurred without cause. The Stirling family, whose lineage stretched back to the Norman conquest, had suffered a catastrophic reversal of fortune at the hands of Marcus Trent, an industrialist whose wealth had been accumulated through the new manufactories that were reshaping England's landscape. Trent had entered into a business partnership with the late Lord Northridge, Evander's father, offering to modernize the family's textile holdings with his revolutionary machinery. What had appeared to be a mutually beneficial arrangement had revealed itself instead as a cunningly constructed trap. Through a series of contracts deliberately written to obscure their true nature, Trent had systematically stripped the Stirling family of control over their own enterprises. When the elder Lord Northridge had finally comprehended the scope of the deception, he had challenged Trent publicly, only to find himself outmaneuvered at every turn. The industrialist had produced documents, witnesses, and legal opinions that painted the Marquis as an incompetent aristocrat attempting to escape his own poor judgment by blaming a commoner of superior business acumen. The scandal had devastated what remained of the Stirling fortune, and, more crucially, had shattered the family's reputation. Society, ever quick to turn upon the wounded, had withdrawn its favor with remarkable speed. Invitations had ceased, credit had evaporated. The humiliation had proven too much for the elder Lord Northridge, whose heart had simply ceased to beat one gray morning as he sat in his study, surrounded by dunning letters and legal documents he could no longer comprehend. Evander had been but 20 years old when he had inherited a title heavy with debt and tarnished with disgrace. His mother, the Dowager Marchioness, had retreated to the family's estate in Northumberland, unable to bear the whispers that followed her through London's streets. His younger sister, Eleanor, had been forced to abandon her hopes of a season and a suitable match, relegated instead to a quiet existence in the country where her damaged name might not preclude all possibility of future happiness. For 5 years, Evander had devoted himself to a single purpose. He had sold every property that could be spared, had economized with a ruthlessness that would have shocked his spendthrift father, and had invested every penny with a shrewd eye that surprised even himself. He had studied Trent's business methods, had learned the language of manufactories and trade that his breeding had taught him to disdain, and had transformed himself from an aristocrat into something far more dangerous, a nobleman who understood both the old world and the new, and who could move between them with deadly efficiency. By the spring of 1815, the Stirling fortune had been largely restored, though the restoration had come through means the ton would never know. Evander had rebuilt his wealth not through the traditional avenues of land and rents, but through the very industrial investments his father had been too proud to pursue independently. The irony was not lost upon him. He had become, in essence, what Trent was, a gentleman whose fortune derived from trade rather than birthright. The difference, he told himself in the dark hours before dawn, was that he had maintained his honor even as he had dirtied his hands. The restoration of fortune, however, had never been his ultimate goal. It had been merely the necessary foundation for what truly consumed him: revenge. Trent had destroyed his father, had stolen his family's security, and had reveled in his triumph over the aristocracy he so clearly despised. For such crimes, mere financial recompense could never suffice. Evander wanted what Trent had taken from the Stirlings: reputation, security, and the certainty that one's place in the world was unassailable. He wanted, quite simply, to destroy Marcus Trent as thoroughly as Trent had destroyed his father. The opportunity had presented itself with almost providential timing. Trent, for all his wealth, remained what society cruelly termed a cit, a wealthy commoner whose money could purchase comfort but never true acceptance among the aristocracy that governed England's social landscape. His wife had been the daughter of a respectable but undistinguished merchant, and while she had given him 3 children before her death, she had not given him the one thing his pride craved: connection to the nobility that looked down upon him even as they accepted his political donations and his loans. His eldest child and only daughter, Annalise, had come of age, and Trent had determined that she would accomplish what he could not. She would marry into the aristocracy and legitimize his wealth with the respectability of a title. He had made no secret of his intentions, and London's impoverished nobility had taken note. 6 younger sons and debt-ridden baronets had already begun circling, willing to overlook the taint of trade in exchange for Trent's substantial dowry. Evander had positioned himself with care. He had allowed himself to be introduced to Trent at a gathering of investors and entrepreneurs, a setting where the industrialist felt confident and superior. He had presented himself as a reformed aristocrat who had learned the value of modern business methods, who regretted the old prejudices that had kept nobility and trade apart, and who saw the future clearly enough to know that cooperation between the two worlds would define the new century. Trent had been flattered and intrigued. Here was a marquis, a man whose ancestors had fought at Agincourt, acknowledging the superiority of the new order. Their conversations had multiplied, moving from business to more personal matters. Evander had been patient, never pushing, always allowing Trent to believe that each step forward had been his own idea. When Trent had finally broached the subject of his daughter, wondering whether a man of Evander's status might consider attending a small dinner party where she would be present, Evander had appeared to consider the matter carefully before agreeing. He had seen the triumph in Trent's eyes and had felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The trap was set, and the prey was walking into it with confidence. Annalise Trent existed in a peculiar space within London society, neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected. Her father's wealth ensured that she received invitations to most gatherings, but the finest drawing rooms remained closed to her. She attended Almack's only because her father had called in favors and made donations that could not be refused, but she had noticed the way the patronesses' smiles never quite reached their eyes. She had been raised with every advantage that money could provide. Her education had been overseen by a succession of governesses who had taught her French, Italian, music, drawing, and all the accomplishments expected of a young lady. Her wardrobe came from the finest modistes on Bond Street. Her jewels would not have shamed a duchess. Yet she had learned early that these advantages could not purchase what mattered most in society. The ease of belonging, the security of knowing one's place was assured. Her nature had responded to this uncertain position with a determined optimism that sometimes bordered on willful blindness. She chose to see the best in people, to interpret cool civility as genuine friendship, to believe that kindness and goodness would eventually overcome the prejudices that governed the ton. Her father's business dealings troubled her when she allowed herself to think of them, but she had learned to accept his assurances that he conducted himself honorably, that any complaints against him came from those who envied his success or resented the changes sweeping through England. She loved her father with the uncomplicated devotion of a daughter who had lost her mother young and who had been her father's primary companion through her childhood. She remembered hours spent in his study, learning to read while he reviewed contracts, accompanying him on tours of his manufactories where the great machines fascinated her, even as the workers' conditions troubled her generous heart. She had believed him when he said he treated his workers better than most, that progress sometimes required difficult transitions, that the old ways had to give way to efficiency and innovation. At 20 years old, she retained enough innocence to believe that love might transcend the barriers of class and circumstance, that her father's hopes for her marriage might align with her own dreams of affection and partnership. She had not yet learned that in the marriage mart of Regency London, love was considered a pleasant addition to a suitable match, but never a requirement, and certainly never a justification for an unsuitable one. When her father had informed her that the Marquis of Northridge would be attending their dinner party, she had felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with caution. She had heard the whispers about Lord Northridge's transformation from wastrel to serious gentleman, about his mysterious years away from society, about the fortune he had somehow rebuilt against all odds. The gossips could not agree on whether he was seeking a wealthy bride out of necessity or whether his restoration was complete enough that he could afford to marry for other reasons. The dinner party took place at the Trent residence on Grosvenor Square, a house that spoke volumes about its owner's trajectory. Upon entering, Lord Northridge was met with a profusion of gilded furniture that seemed to announce its price rather than its provenance, and walls crowded with the works of fashionable contemporary painters whose signatures were more prominent than their subjects. Marble busts of classical figures stood in niches clearly designed for their display, but the stone was too white, too new, lacking the mellowed patina that marked truly ancient collections. It was the home of a man who had purchased everything but understood the value of nothing, who mistook expense for elegance and accumulation for taste. Annalise had been dressed with particular care in a gown of pale blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes. Her dark hair had been arranged in the Grecian style currently fashionable, with pearl pins that had belonged to her mother. She had descended the stairs to find the drawing room already populated with the sort of guests her father favored, a mix of wealthy merchants, reform-minded politicians, and those members of the gentry willing to overlook social distinctions in exchange for excellent wine and the possibility of profitable introductions. Lord Northridge had arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his punctuality itself a statement about his reformed character. The old aristocracy considered it fashionable to arrive late, but Evander had shed such pretensions along with many others. He had been dressed with austere elegance, his dark coat perfectly tailored but unadorned with the fobs and seals many gentlemen favored. His cravat had been tied in the simple mathematical, precise and unshowy. Everything about his appearance suggested a man who had no need to impress, but who understood the value of appropriate presentation. Annalise's first impression, formed as her father had made the introduction, had been of intensity barely contained beneath a veneer of perfect manners. Lord Northridge's eyes were gray, she had noted, of that particular shade that could appear cold as winter ice or warm as morning mist, depending upon the light and his mood. When he had bowed over her hand, his touch had been brief but proper, and she had felt an unexpected shock of awareness that had colored her cheeks. The dinner itself had followed the usual pattern of such gatherings, with conversation ranging across topics of business and politics that would have been considered unsuitable in more traditional homes, but which her father's guests found stimulating. Annalise had been seated at a sufficient distance from Lord Northridge to observe him without the pressure of direct conversation, and she had found herself studying him with unusual attention. He had spoken little but with precision when he did contribute to the discussion. His opinions on the changes sweeping through England's economy had been measured and thoughtful, acknowledging both the benefits of industrial progress and the costs borne by those displaced by such changes. Several of her father's guests, who had expected aristocratic disdain for trade, had appeared surprised and pleased by his informed perspective. Her father, she had noticed, had watched Lord Northridge with the satisfied air of a man whose judgment had been confirmed. What had struck Annalise most forcefully, however, had been the moments when Lord Northridge's careful control had slipped just enough to reveal something harder and colder beneath. When one guest had made a jest about the old nobility's inability to adapt to modern times, the Marquess's smile had not reached his eyes. When her father had spoken with particular pride about his success in acquiring property from families forced to sell due to financial difficulties, Lord Northridge's expression had remained pleasant, but something in his stillness had suggested tightly leashed emotion. She had wondered what sorrows had carved such wariness into a man still young enough to be considered eligible and handsome enough to attract attention in any ballroom. She had found herself wanting to ease the tension she sensed in him, to discover what had transformed a nobleman into this careful, controlled stranger who seemed to trust nothing and no one. He found her unrelenting optimism irritating, for it was a quality he had long since discarded as incompatible with the realities of a cruel world. Yet for a disquieting moment, as she spoke of her hope that industry and tradition might find harmony, he felt not scorn, but a pang of something akin to loss for the man he once was, before grief had calcified his heart into stone. After dinner, when the ladies had withdrawn to leave the gentlemen to their port, Annalise had endured the usual routine of polite conversation with the other female guests. She had deflected questions about Lord Northridge with the vagueness expected of a proper young lady, but she had noticed the speculative glances exchanged by the matrons present. Everyone understood why the Marquis had been invited, and everyone was eager to observe whether Marcus Trent's ambitions would be realized. When the gentlemen had rejoined them, Annalise had been asked to perform at the pianoforte, a request she had fulfilled with competent but unremarkable skill. She had no illusions about her musical talent. Her fingers moved correctly across the keys, producing the notes precisely as written, but she lacked the inspired touch that transformed mere accuracy into art. As she had played a Mozart sonata, she had been aware of Lord Northridge's gaze upon her, assessing her performance with the same careful attention he had directed toward everything else that evening. The evening had concluded with Lord Northridge requesting permission to call upon her, a request her father had granted with poorly concealed pleasure. As the guests had departed, Annalise had found herself standing at the window of her chamber, watching the street below where carriages rolled away into the London night, and wondering whether she had just met the man who would shape her future. She had wanted to believe that the intensity she had sensed in Lord Northridge came from interest in her, from attraction, or at least curiosity. She had allowed herself to imagine that perhaps this accomplished, mysterious gentleman might see past her father's wealth to the person she was, might value her optimistic nature and generous heart. She had indulged in the romantic fantasy that afflicts young women when they encounter someone who troubles their composure and quickens their pulse. What she could not have known, standing at her window with hope blooming in her heart, was that Lord Northridge had departed that evening with satisfaction of an entirely different nature. His assessment of her had been thorough and calculated. She was pretty enough to make the marriage believable, young enough to be malleable, innocent enough to be deceived. Her obvious affection for her father would make her suffer more acutely when Evander revealed Trent's true nature and destroyed everything the industrialist had built. She would be, Evander had concluded as his carriage carried him through the London streets, the perfect instrument of his revenge. Through her, he would gain access to Trent's business dealings, his social connections, and his vulnerabilities. Through her dowry, he would have the final resources needed to execute his plans. And through her inevitable heartbreak when she discovered the truth, Trent would experience something of the anguish Evander's own family had endured. The courtship that followed proceeded with the inevitability of a carefully constructed mechanism clicking into place. Lord Northridge called at the prescribed times, bringing flowers that were expensive but never ostentatious. He requested permission to drive Annalise through Hyde Park during the fashionable hour when all of society would observe them together. He secured vouchers for her to attend a subscription ball at Almack's, where his consequence could reflect favorably upon her dubious social position. Marcus Trent observed these developments with mounting triumph. He had secured what he wanted, a Marcus for his daughter, a title that would legitimize his wealth and open doors previously closed to him. He increased Annalise's dowry voluntarily, wanting to ensure that Lord Northridge had every incentive to complete the match quickly. He spoke freely to his prospective son-in-law about his business affairs, believing he was cultivating a valuable ally within the aristocracy. London society watched the developing courtship with its customary mixture of interest and judgment. The betting books at White's filled with wagers about whether the Marquis would actually go through with marrying Trent's daughter, or whether his pride would ultimately prevent him from such a mésalliance. The gossips debated whether love or money motivated Lord Northridge, and most concluded, with the cynicism typical of the Tun, that money must be the deciding factor despite his apparent restoration of fortune. Annalise, insulated from the harshest whispers by her father's protective presence and her own determined optimism, allowed herself to fall in love with remarkable speed and completeness. Lord Northridge's reserved manner struck her as romantic rather than cold. His careful attention to propriety seemed to indicate respect rather than indifference. The rare moments when he appeared to relax in her presence felt like precious victories, evidence that she was reaching the wounded man she believed existed beneath his controlled exterior. During their drives through Hyde Park, she would comment upon the beauty of the spring flowers or the elegance of a particularly fine equipage, and he would respond with observations that revealed his intelligence and education. She learned that he had read widely during his years away from society, that he had opinions on poetry and politics, that he noticed details others overlooked. She interpreted his attention to her words as genuine interest rather than the careful study it actually was. When they attended the theater together, properly chaperoned by her father and his sister, Annalise had found herself more aware of Lord Northridge's presence beside her than of the performance unfolding on stage. The brush of his sleeve against hers had sent inappropriate warmth through her body. The timbre of his voice when he had leaned close to make some observation about the play had caused her breath to catch. She had recognized these sensations as the stirrings of passion and had been grateful that society's rules prevented her from acting upon such feelings before marriage sanctified them. What she had interpreted as growing affection, however, had been Evander's careful cultivation of exactly the response he required. Every gesture, every word, every seemingly spontaneous moment of connection had been calculated to ensnare her completely. He needed her to love him, to trust him absolutely, because only then would her eventual suffering achieve the impact he desired. Only then would Trent understand what it meant to have one's family destroyed by someone they had trusted. The proposal, when it came, occurred during a morning visit at Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, that respectable establishment where young ladies could browse with relative freedom while their chaperones maintained watchful proximity. Annalise had been examining a newly published volume of poetry when Lord Northridge had approached with another book in hand, this one a collection of sonnets by Shakespeare. He had opened it to a particular page and had read aloud, his voice low enough that only she could hear, the sonnet that begins, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." The words themselves had been romantic, but his delivery had been curiously flat, as though he recited something memorized rather than felt. Annalise, however, had heard only the content, and not the delivery, had seen only the gesture, and not the emptiness behind it. When he had closed the book and asked with perfect formality whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, she had felt tears spring to her eyes. She had whispered her acceptance, aware of the other patrons pretending not to observe this intimate moment, and had allowed herself to believe that she had found what every young woman dreamed of, a love match that would also satisfy her father's ambitions. The engagement was announced in the Morning Post the following week, generating the expected flurry of commentary throughout the Tun. Some proclaimed it a brilliant match that proved Lord Northridge's pragmatism. Others whispered that he had sold himself too cheaply, that surely a marquis of his consequence could have found a wealthy bride with better breeding. Still, others suggested that perhaps genuine affection had developed, that stranger things had happened in London's marriage mart. Marcus Trent, celebrated with the enthusiasm of a man who had achieved his life's greatest ambition. He threw a lavish ball to mark the engagement, inviting everyone of consequence and spare no expense in demonstrating his triumph. The event took place at his residence, with every room opened and decorated with the sort of profusion that made certain guests exchange knowing glances. Flowers covered every surface, musicians filled the air with music, and champagne flowed with a generosity that bordered on excess. Annalise, resplendent in white silk trimmed with silver thread, received congratulations from guests whose sincerity varied widely. She danced the first 2 dances with her betrothed, as protocol demanded, and felt as though she floated rather than walked. Lord Northridge's hand at her waist, even through the proper layers of fabric and propriety, sent shivers of anticipation through her. She looked forward to marriage with an eagerness that would have shocked her governesses, though she barely understood the physical implications of what she anticipated. Evander, for his part, played his role with perfection. He smiled at his bride, attended to her comfort, and gave every appearance of a man satisfied with his choice. Internally, he was calculating how long he needed to wait after the wedding before beginning the systematic destruction of Marcus Trent's empire. He had already identified the weak points in Trent's business dealings, the contracts that could be challenged, the partnerships that could be dissolved, the investments that could be undermined. He had secured positions of trust within several of Trent's companies, using his new connection as prospective son-in-law to gain access to information previously denied him. He had cultivated relationships with Trent's rivals, men who would be only too happy to assist in taking down the upstart industrialist if given the opportunity. He had documented evidence of business practices that, while perhaps not illegal, were certainly unethical enough to damage Trent's reputation if revealed publicly. The weapon of his revenge was nearly forged. Only one piece remained: the marriage itself. The binding of Annalise to him in a union that would give him complete access to her father's affairs and make her complicit, however unwittingly, in her own family's destruction. The banns were read, and the wedding date was set for June, that most favored month for fashionable marriages. Annalise spent her days in a flurry of preparation, selecting her trousseau, planning the wedding breakfast, and dreaming of her future as the Marchioness of Northridge. She imagined a life of companionship and growing affection, of children who would inherit both her father's industry and her husband's noble lineage, of a marriage that would bridge the divide between old aristocracy and new wealth. Her father, meanwhile, had begun treating Lord Northridge as a partner rather than merely a prospective relation, sharing details of his business ventures and seeking his opinion on various matters. Evander had been careful to offer advice that appeared helpful while subtly steering Trent toward decisions that would later prove disadvantageous. He was building his case brick by brick, creating the foundation for a collapse that would be both thorough and irreversible. The wedding took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, that church where fashionable London married and was seen to marry. Despite the early hour required by the law, the pews filled with guests representing both Trent's world of commerce and the fringes of the aristocracy willing to acknowledge the match. The absence of certain notable families spoke as loudly as the presence of others, a reminder that even a marquis marrying for obvious financial reasons could not compel universal acceptance. Annalise, dressed in white satin with Brussels lace and her mother's pearls, stood at the altar beside Lord Northridge and promised to love, honor, and obey him for the remainder of her life. She meant every word with the full devotion of her innocent heart. Evander, responding with equal solemnity, gave the same promises while meaning something entirely different. He would provide for her physical comfort, would maintain the appearance of propriety, but love had no place in his carefully constructed plans. The wedding breakfast at the Trent residence followed the ceremony, with toasts and speeches that celebrated the union of two families and two worlds. Marcus Trent's toast to his new son-in-law spoke of bridges built and prejudices overcome, of a future where merit mattered more than bloodlines. Evander's response, carefully crafted to appear gracious, spoke of the honor of being welcomed into such a family and the hope that their alliance would prosper. Only he understood the double meaning in his words. The departure for the wedding journey took place in late afternoon, with Annalise waving goodbye to her father from the window of Lord Northridge's traveling coach. They were bound for his estate in Northumberland, that property he had managed to retain through all his financial struggles because it was entailed and therefore protected from creditors. Anneliese had never traveled so far from London, and the prospect of weeks alone with her new husband filled her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The journey north proceeded in careful stages, with stops at coaching inns that had been selected for their respectability rather than their comfort. During the long hours in the coach, Anneliese attempted to initiate conversations that might bridge the strange distance she sensed in her husband. She spoke of her hopes for their future, of her desire to be a good wife, of her intention to learn all she could about managing his estates and supporting his interests. Evander responded with courtesy, but without warmth. He had explained, with words chosen to wound subtly rather than obviously, that he expected her to be a proper marchioness, which meant maintaining appearances while not interfering in matters beyond her understanding. He had established from the beginning that theirs would be a marriage of form rather than substance, though he had cloaked this reality in language about propriety and the dignity of her new position. The first night of their marriage, spent at a respectable inn midway to their destination, had devastated what remained of Anneliese's romantic illusions. Evander had fulfilled his marital obligations with mechanical efficiency, treating the physical aspects of marriage as a duty to be discharged rather than an intimacy to be shared. He had been neither cruel nor kind, merely distant, and Anneliese had lain awake afterward trying to reconcile this cold stranger with the man she thought she had married. She had told herself that perhaps he was merely nervous, that perhaps aristocratic reserve prevented him from showing warmer feelings, that perhaps time and patience would reveal the affection she hoped existed beneath his controlled exterior. She had clung to these rationalizations even as doubt began its corrosive work upon her heart. Northridge Hall, when they finally arrived after a week of travel, proved to be a magnificent pile of stone and history situated amid dramatic moorland scenery. The house itself bore evidence of both ancient grandeur and more recent neglect. Certain rooms shone with care and proper maintenance, while others showed the effects of years when funds for upkeep had been scarce. The contrast served as a visible reminder of the family's fall and partial recovery. Evander's mother, the Dowager Marchioness, greeted her new daughter-in-law with frigid correctness that barely masked hostility. She had opposed the match from the moment Evander had informed her of his intentions, seeing in it only the final degradation of a family that had already suffered too much. She could not forgive Anneliese for being Marcus Trent's daughter, and she made no effort to hide her resentment even as she maintained the forms of civility. Eleanor, Evander's sister, proved somewhat warmer, but maintained a careful distance. At 23, she had resigned herself to permanent spinsterhood, believing that no gentleman of suitable rank would overlook her family's damaged reputation and reduced circumstances. She viewed Anneliese with a mixture of pity and curiosity, unable to decide whether her brother's bride was innocent victim or willing participant in whatever schemes drove his actions. The weeks following their arrival at Northridge Hall settled into a pattern that Anneliese found increasingly difficult to endure. Her husband spent his days closeted in his study, managing correspondence and business affairs about which he never spoke to her. He joined the family for dinner with punctual regularity, participated in conversation with formal courtesy, and then withdrew again to his private domain. The nights brought brief, passionless encounters that left Anneliese feeling more alone than if he had ignored her entirely. She attempted to establish herself as mistress of the household, but the Dowager Marchioness maintained iron control over all domestic arrangements and made clear that she had no intention of yielding authority to a merchant's daughter. Anneliese's suggestions for improvements or changes were received with cold politeness and then ignored. Her attempts to befriend the servants met with cautious reserve. They had been with the family too long to immediately accept an outsider, particularly one whose father's money had purchased her position. The isolation pressed upon her spirit like a physical weight. In London, she had been surrounded by activity and companionship, even if that companionship had sometimes been more mercenary than genuine. Here, in the wild beauty of Northumberland, she found herself trapped in a house where she was neither wanted nor needed, married to a man who treated her with less warmth than he showed his horses. One morning, desperate for occupation and connection, she had ventured down to the village that sat on Northridge land. She had thought perhaps she might make herself useful among the tenants, offering assistance as she had once done at her father's manufactories. She had imagined winning over the community through kindness and generosity, proving herself worthy of her position through actions rather than breeding. The visit had been a disaster. The villagers, loyal to the Sterling family for generations, remembered well how the old Marquis had died and why. They knew that Annalise's father had been instrumental in the family's ruin, and they saw in her only the daughter of their lord's enemy. Their courtesy had been strained. Their acceptance of her offered assistance grudging at best. She had returned to the hall feeling more alone than ever, understanding for the first time the true depth of the chasm between her father's world and her husband's. It was Eleanor who finally took pity on her loneliness and began to unbend slightly toward her. The two young women, both trapped in circumstances neither had chosen, found tentative common ground in their shared isolation. During long walks across the moors, Eleanor began to speak of the family's history, of happier times before the catastrophe that had changed everything. One afternoon, as they sat in the ruined tower that stood on a hill overlooking the estate, Eleanor revealed the story Annalise had never known. She spoke of Marcus Trent's partnership with their father, of the contracts and agreements that had seemed so promising, of the terrible moment when they had discovered how thoroughly they had been deceived. She described their father's deterioration, his desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage, and his final heartbroken surrender to death. Annalise had listened with growing horror, pieces of truth clicking into place like a puzzle she had been trying to ignore. She remembered fragments of conversation from her childhood, business discussions she had not fully understood, her father's satisfaction when speaking of properties acquired from distressed sellers. She had not wanted to see the pattern, but Eleanor's words forced recognition upon her. When Eleanor had finished, she had looked at Annalise with something approaching sympathy and said that she hoped her brother would not destroy his soul entirely in pursuit of revenge, that she feared he had married not for restoration but for retribution, and that Annalise had been caught in a war that began before she had even entered society. The walk back to the hall had passed in silence, with Annalise's mind racing through implications she could barely process. Yet doubt gnawed at her. Could the entire fault truly rest with her father alone? The question troubled her sleep and occupied her thoughts during the long hours when Evander remained closeted in his study. She determined to discover the truth for herself, not from Eleanor's pain-filtered memories or her husband's vengeful certainty, but from documents and accounts that could not be colored by emotion. She began carefully, spending mornings in the estate office, ostensibly learning the management of household accounts as befitted her position. The estate steward, Mr. Pemberton, an elderly man who had served the Sterling family for 40 years, proved unexpectedly willing to speak once he understood she sought truth rather than vindication. One gray afternoon, with rain pattering against the windows of the estate office, Annalise had been examining the account books from the years preceding the elder Lord Northridge's death when she came upon a series of entries that made her pause. Mr. Pemberton, noticing her stillness, had approached and peered over her shoulder at the page. His weathered hand had pointed to a particular notation, and his voice had carried the weight of reluctant honesty as he explained what she was seeing. The late Marquis, he revealed, had withheld payment on several contracts with Trent's manufactories, payment that was clearly due according to the partnership terms. When Trent had protested, the Marquis had used his social position to pressure mutual associates, attempting to force the industrialist to accept less than what was owed. Mr. Pemberton had pulled another ledger from the shelves, this one containing correspondence, and had shown Annalise letters in her father-in-law's own hand. The words on those yellowed pages spoke of contempt for men of trade, of aristocratic entitlement, of a determination to demonstrate that a mere industrialist could never be an equal partner to a nobleman, regardless of what contracts might state. Annalise had traced her fingers over the faded ink, feeling her understanding of the conflict shift and reshape itself. Her father had indeed responded with ruthless methods, had indeed destroyed the Sterling family financially. But he had done so after being cheated and publicly humiliated by a man who believed his title gave him the right to break agreements with impunity. The walk back to the hall had passed in silence, with Annalise's mind racing through implications she could barely process. She had married a man who had every reason to hate her family, who had been systematically stripped of security and status by her father's actions. The coldness she had attributed to aristocratic reserve or natural reticence suddenly revealed itself as carefully maintained hatred. She had not been chosen for herself, but for what she represented: access to Marcus Trent and the means to destroy him. That evening, she had confronted Evander in his study, demanding truth with a directness that would have shocked her former self. She had asked whether he had married her for revenge, whether he had ever felt anything for her beyond calculation, whether their entire courtship had been an elaborate deception designed to position himself for assault upon her father. Evander had not bothered to lie. Perhaps he was tired of maintaining the pretense, or perhaps he judged that the time had come to reveal his hand. He had confirmed everything: his deliberate cultivation of her father's trust, his strategic courtship of her affection, his intention to use his position as son-in-law to expose Trent's fraudulent business practices and destroy the industrial empire built on the Sterling family's ruin. He had spoken without heat or passion, laying out his plans with the same cool precision he applied to everything. He would reveal evidence of Trent's manipulation of contracts, his bribery of officials, his exploitation of workers, and his systematic theft of properties from families he had deliberately driven to financial distress. The scandal would be complete and devastating. Trent would face criminal prosecution, social ostracism, and financial ruin. Everything he had built would crumble, and he would die as Evander's father had died, broken and disgraced. Annalise had listened with tears streaming down her face, understanding at last the full scope of her mistake. She had given her heart to a man incapable of receiving it, had bound herself for life to someone who viewed her merely as a weapon to be deployed against her family. The love she had felt, still felt despite everything, had been entirely one-sided, a delusion she had constructed from hope and naivety. When Evander had finished his cold recitation of plans and intentions, she had asked him what he expected of her now that she knew the truth. Would he continue the charade? Would he expect her cooperation in destroying her father? Or would he simply ignore her while he proceeded with his schemes? His response had been the cruelest blow of all. He had said that he expected nothing from her except that she maintain appearances and stay out of his way. Her feelings were irrelevant to his purpose. Her father's crimes demanded punishment, and nothing she could say or do would deter him from exacting it. If she chose to warn Trent, he would simply adjust his approach. If she chose to leave, he would pursue his revenge without her. She was irrelevant, except as a symbol of his triumph. The weeks that followed marked the darkest period of Annalise's young life. She remained at Northridge Hall, trapped by the marriage vows she had taken and by the social impossibility of abandoning her position. Divorce was unthinkable, separation barely less scandalous. She had made her choice, or rather had it made for her through deception, and now she must live with the consequences. Trent had responded with the weapons available to him: superior business acumen, legal maneuvering, and ruthless determination. He had indeed destroyed the Sterling family financially, but he had done so within the bounds of law, however much he had bent ethics in the process. The elder Lord Northridge's death had been tragic, but it had come from his inability to accept a changing world where birth no longer guaranteed success and where men of trade could defeat men of title. Neither man had been entirely right or entirely wrong. Both had been flawed human beings pursuing their own interests with insufficient regard for the damage their conflict inflicted on innocence. The feud that consumed Evander had its roots in pride on both sides, in old prejudices meeting new ambitions, in the death throes of one social order and the violent birth of another. Annalise understood that these nuances would mean nothing to Evander. His father's death had transformed a business dispute into a personal vendetta. He could not see past his grief and anger to recognize the complexity of the situation. And her father, she realized with painful clarity, would never acknowledge the full extent of his own culpability. Both men were locked in combat, and she stood between them, torn by loyalty to family and love for a husband who did not want her affection. The decision she reached came slowly, born of long nights spent in prayer and contemplation. She would not assist Evander in his revenge, but neither would she warn her father of the danger he faced. Instead, she would attempt to broker peace, to force both men to see past their anger to a resolution that did not require complete destruction of either party. It was perhaps a futile hope, but it was the only path she could see that did not betray either her marriage vows or her filial duty. She began by writing to her father, carefully worded letters that attempted to warn him without revealing Evander's specific plans. She suggested that he review his business practices, ensure all contracts were beyond legal challenge, and consider making restitution to any parties who might have been unfairly treated. She framed these suggestions as coming from her new understanding of aristocratic society and its expectations, hoping he would heed them without realizing their true purpose. Marcus Trent, secure in his triumph and blind to any threat from a son-in-law who seemed properly grateful for the alliance, largely ignored her advice. He responded with affectionate but dismissive letters, assuring her that his business affairs were impeccably managed and that she need not worry her pretty head about such matters. His confidence would prove to be catastrophically misplaced. Autumn arrived with its customary beauty, painting the Northumberland moors in shades of gold and russet. Evander announced that they would return to London for the little season, that brief period of social activity before winter drove society to their country estates. Annalise, who had dreaded remaining isolated at Northridge Hall, found herself equally reluctant to return to London, where the drama she feared would inevitably unfold. The journey south retraced their wedding journey, but in reverse, and Annalise could not help but reflect on how much had changed in the intervening months. She had departed London as a naive bride believing herself loved. She returned as a marchioness who understood the full price of her position and the full scope of her mistake. The title she bore, which her father had so eagerly purchased, now felt like chains binding her to circumstances she could neither escape nor control. In London, Evander's plans began to manifest with devastating efficiency. He had spent months cultivating relationships with Trent's business rivals, with reform-minded politicians who opposed the worst excesses of industrial expansion, and with journalists who specialized in exposing corruption among the newly wealthy. Now he began to feed them information carefully selected to build a case against his father-in-law. The first articles appeared in late October, published in newspapers that catered to the respectable middle classes and the reform-minded aristocracy. They detailed labor practices at certain manufactories owned by Marcus Trent, describing conditions that shocked readers accustomed to thinking of industry as uniformly progressive and beneficial. Children as young as 6 worked 14-hour days. Workers injured by machinery received no compensation. Wages were paid in scrip redeemable only at company stores that charged inflated prices. Annalise first learned of the scandal not through her husband's cold announcement, but through the casual cruelty of London society. She had been taking tea in the drawing room of Lady Pemberton, a baronet's wife, who had always maintained a cordial if distant relationship with her when 2 other ladies had been announced. The conversation had proceeded normally enough at first, touching upon the weather and upcoming musical performances, until one of the newly arrived guests had made an observation about the morning's newspapers. Lady Ashford, a matron known for her sharp tongue and sharper observations, had remarked with barely concealed satisfaction that it seemed certain industrialists had finally been exposed for the heartless profiteers they truly were. She had proceeded to detail, with relish that made Annalise's stomach turn, the conditions described in the articles about Trent's manufactories. Children forced to crawl beneath massive looms, their small fingers crushed when they moved too slowly. Workers maimed by machinery and turned out without a penny. families living in squalor while their employer built monuments to his own vanity. The other ladies had clucked with appropriate horror, but Annalise had noticed the sidelong glances directed at her, the barely suppressed smiles that accompanied the outraged exclamations. They were enjoying her discomfort, savoring the fall of a man who had dared to push his daughter into their exclusive circle. Lady Pemberton had attempted to change the subject, but the damage had been done. Annalise had excused herself as soon as propriety allowed, retreating to her carriage with burning cheeks and a heart heavy with shame. She had confronted Evander that evening, demanding to know if the articles were his doing. He had not denied it, had merely observed that truth required no embellishment, that her father's practices spoke for themselves. Annalise had wanted to defend her father, to insist that he was not uniquely cruel, that many industrialists maintained similar conditions. But the words had died on her lips because she had always known in the part of herself she tried to ignore, that the accusations were fundamentally true. Trent attempted to dismiss the articles as attacks by envious competitors, but the details were too specific and too damning to be easily ignored. Evander had provided documentation that proved the claims beyond reasonable doubt. Within weeks, reformist politicians were calling for investigations. Religious leaders were denouncing the exploitation from their pulpits. Society matrons who had tolerated Trent for his wealth began to withdraw their favor. The second wave of revelations came in November, focusing on Trent's business methods rather than his labor practices. Articles documented how he had systematically acquired properties from distressed aristocratic families, often using information gained through social connections to time his offers for maximum advantage. They revealed contracts written in deliberately obscure language designed to trap unwary partners. They exposed bribes paid to officials who controlled industrial licenses and permits. Each revelation damaged Trent's reputation more severely than the last. The man who had worked so hard to gain social acceptance found himself increasingly isolated. Invitations ceased. Business associates began to distance themselves. Political allies who had accepted his donations now claimed no knowledge of any improper dealings. The edifice of respectability he had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Annalise watched this destruction unfold with anguished helplessness. She understood that her father bore responsibility for his actions, that many of the accusations against him were fundamentally true, but she also saw the human cost of Evander's methodical revenge. Her father's letters grew increasingly desperate, pleading with her to use her influence with her husband to stop the attacks. He could not conceive that his own son-in-law orchestrated his destruction. She attempted to intercede with Evander, begging him to show mercy, to accept some form of restitution short of complete ruin, to remember that vengeance consumed the avenger as thoroughly as the target. He had listened to her pleas with the same cold courtesy he showed to everything, then had informed her that her father's crimes demanded full accounting and that nothing would deflect him from his purpose. In December, the final blow fell. Evander revealed evidence of the original contracts between Trent and his father, along with documentation showing how Trent had deliberately manipulated their terms to engineer the Sterling family's financial collapse. He demonstrated that what Trent had claimed as legitimate business practice had actually constituted fraud, actionable in both civil and criminal courts. The revelation destroyed what remained of Marcus Trent's reputation and threatened his liberty. Prosecutors began to investigate whether criminal charges should be filed. Civil lawsuits materialized from families who claimed to have been similarly victimized by Trent's methods. Banks that had extended him credit now demanded immediate repayment. The industrial empire that had taken 30 years to build teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Trent, facing ruin more complete than anything he had inflicted on the Sterlings, responded with desperate measures. He could not accept that his own son-in-law had orchestrated his destruction, but he had begun to suspect that Lord Northridge was at minimum failing to use his influence to defend his wife's family. In his desperation, he made inquiries among men whose services existed in the shadows of London's underworld, men who could solve problems that respectable society preferred to ignore. Annalise, visiting her father at his residence on Grosvenor Square, found him altered almost beyond recognition. The confident industrialist who had dominated every space he occupied had been replaced by a man who appeared decades older, whose eyes held a feverish quality that frightened her. When she had attempted to speak of accepting responsibility and making amends, he had laughed bitterly and said that the time for such niceties had passed, that he would not go down without fighting, that those who attacked him would learn the cost of such presumption. She had left that visit with dread coiling in her stomach, sensing that her father contemplated actions that would only compound the tragedy consuming both families. She had tried to warn Evander, suggesting that perhaps it was time to relent, that her father had been sufficiently humbled, that further pursuit might provoke desperate retaliation. Evander had dismissed her concerns with the same infuriating calm he brought to everything, certain that a broken man posed no threat. He had underestimated both Marcus Trent's desperation and his connections to London's dangerous underside. The attack came on a December evening as Evander returned from a meeting with his solicitors in Lincoln's Inn. The street was poorly lit, the hour late enough that respectable residents had withdrawn indoors. The men who emerged from the shadows were professionals, hired muscle, who knew their business and intended to execute it efficiently. They meant to beat Evander severely enough to send a message but not kill him outright, for even Marcus Trent retained enough sense to know that murdering a marquess would bring consequences no amount of money could deflect. Annalise, who had grown increasingly anxious about her father's state of mind, had been unable to rest that evening. Something had driven her from her drawing room, some premonition or perhaps divine intervention. When Evander had announced he was departing for his appointment, she had felt a terror she could not name but could not ignore. She had insisted, with unprecedented forcefulness, that she must accompany him, fabricating a sudden need to visit her father's residence, which lay not far from his destination. Evander had attempted to dissuade her, citing the lateness of the hour and the impropriety of such a visit, but she had been adamant with a determination that brooked no refusal. Their carriage had therefore carried both of them through the London streets, with her lady's maid accompanying as required chaperone. They had reached Lincoln's Inn, and Evander had descended to conduct his business, leaving Annalise to wait in the carriage with instructions to proceed to her father's residence and send the vehicle back for him. But Annalise had not departed. The sense of wrongness had only intensified, and she had ordered the coachman to wait, to remain where they could observe the street outside the solicitor's chambers. Her maid had protested that they should not linger in such an area after dark, but Annalise had been immovable. They had waited, and when Evander had emerged and begun walking toward the corner where he expected to find a hackney, Annalise had seen the shadows resolve into men. Her scream had shattered the evening quiet, alerting Evander to the danger even as the attackers closed upon him. The coachman, a former soldier in the late wars, had leaped from his perch and rushed toward the fray with the stout cudgel he kept beneath his seat. Annalise herself had thrown open the carriage door despite her maid's horrified protests, adding her voice to the commotion in hopes of rousing nearby residents. Her arrival disrupted the attackers' plans. They had not expected witnesses, certainly not a marchioness whose presence transformed a simple beating into something far more complicated. One of the men, younger and more panicked than his companions, had grabbed Annalise as she ran toward her husband, perhaps thinking to use her as hostage or shield. Evander, bloodied but still fighting with the assistance of the loyal coachman, had seen his wife in the man's grasp and had experienced in that moment a transformation more profound than any he had undergone in 5 years of cultivating revenge. All his carefully constructed hatred had evaporated in the face of a single inescapable truth. He could not bear to see her harmed. Somewhere in the months of their marriage, despite his determination to feel nothing, despite his conviction that she was merely a tool to be used, she had become something else entirely. She had become precious beyond his ability to acknowledge or his willingness to admit. The man holding Annalise had produced a knife, threatening to harm her unless his companions were allowed to complete their business with Lord Northridge. It was a desperate gambit born of panic rather than planning, but it might have succeeded had Evander responded with calculation rather than instinct. Instead, when the man's attention wavered for a moment, when Anneliese had struggled to break free, Evander had lunged forward without regard for his own safety. The knife meant for Anneliese had found Evander's chest instead, sliding between ribs with terrible precision. The attackers, confronted with a disaster far beyond their commission, had fled into the London night, leaving their victim crumpled on the cobblestones, while his wife screamed for help with a desperation that finally brought residents and watchmen running. The hours that followed existed in Anneliese's memory as fragments of nightmare. The surgeon's grave face as he worked to staunch bleeding that seemed impossible to stop. The townhouse transformed into a makeshift hospital with servants rushing to fetch hot water and clean linens. An express messenger dispatched to Northumberland with news that would take days to deliver. And through it all, Evander unconscious and frighteningly still, his life balanced on a razor's edge between survival and surrender. She had sat beside his bed, refusing to move, holding his hand and willing him to live with an intensity that felt like prayer. She had bargained with God, offering anything, everything, if only he would spare this man she loved despite all reason. She had whispered confessions he could not hear, telling him that she understood his pain, that she forgave his deception, that she loved him not for what he had pretended to be, but for the wounded, complicated man he actually was. In the gray hours before dawn, when the surgeon had finally admitted he could do no more, and they must simply wait to see whether Lord Northridge possessed the strength to survive, Anneliese had felt rage kindle alongside her fear. Her father had done this. Her father, who claimed to love her, had hired men to attack her husband, and in doing so had nearly destroyed them both. She had left Evander's bedside only long enough to write a letter, words burning across the page with fury and heartbreak. She had told her father exactly what his actions had cost, had described Evander lying near death because of wounds meant to silence him, had made clear that if her husband died, she would see her father prosecuted for murder, regardless of the cost to herself. She had severed all ties between them, choosing her husband over her father with a finality that admitted no compromise. A message had been dispatched to Northumberland by the fastest express rider, and 4 days later, a travel-worn Dowager Marchioness arrived with Eleanor, both women pale with exhaustion and shock. The journey had been undertaken with reckless speed, changing horses at every posting inn and traveling through the night despite the December cold. They had come expecting to find Evander already dead or dying, and the relief of discovering him still clinging to life had been almost painful in its intensity. When Evander had finally opened his eyes on the 5th day after the attack, weak and disoriented, but undeniably alive, the first person he saw was Anneliese. She had barely left his side, ignoring the surgeon's advice to rest, refusing all attempts by the Dowager Marchioness to assume the sickroom duties. When his gaze had focused on her face, when recognition had stirred in his eyes, she had seen something there she had never witnessed before: vulnerability, gratitude, and perhaps the first fragile beginning of actual affection. His recovery proved slow and difficult. The knife had come dangerously close to his heart, and infection threatened repeatedly to undo the surgeon's work. Through it all, Anneliese nursed him with devotion that gradually wore away the last of his carefully constructed defenses. She read to him when he grew restless, adjusted his pillows when he struggled to find comfortable positions, brought him broth and coaxed him to eat when he had no appetite. They talked during those long hours of convalescence, truly talked for perhaps the first time in their marriage. Evander, stripped of his strength and his ability to maintain emotional distance, found himself confessing things he had never intended to reveal. He spoke of his father's death, of the guilt he felt for being unable to prevent it, of the years spent rebuilding fortune while nursing hatred, of the emptiness that had consumed him even as he achieved his goals. He admitted that his plan for revenge had proceeded exactly as designed, that he had succeeded in destroying Marcus Trent as thoroughly as Trent had destroyed his father. But the triumph he had anticipated for years had turned to ashes in his mouth. Victory felt indistinguishable from defeat when purchased at the price of his own soul and his wife's anguish. Most significantly, he confessed that somewhere in their months together, she had become more important to him than revenge, though he had been too blind and too stubborn to acknowledge it until faced with the prospect of her harm. The moment he had seen her in danger, all his carefully constructed hatred had revealed itself as hollow compared to the terror of losing her. Annalise, listening to these halting admissions, felt something shift in her own heart. The man she loved was finally visible beneath the armor he had worn for so long. He was flawed and damaged, scarred by grief and consumed by anger he was only now beginning to release. But he was also capable of growth, of recognizing his mistakes, of choosing a different path when confronted with the consequences of the old one. She told him of her own journey, of how she had learned the truth about both families, of how she had come to understand that the conflict between their fathers had no heroes, only wounded men responding to wounds with further wounding. She spoke of her choice to stand between them, to refuse participation in continued destruction, and of her determination to forge a different future from the poisoned past they had inherited. When Evander was finally strong enough to leave his bed, when the surgeon pronounced him recovering, though still far from full health, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible mere months before. He summoned his solicitors and instructed them to cease all legal action against Marcus Trent. He would not actively assist Trent in rebuilding what had been destroyed, but neither would he continue to pursue his father-in-law's complete ruin. He drafted a letter to Trent, painful in its honesty, acknowledging that while he could not forgive what had been done to his family, he recognized that continued vengeance served no purpose beyond perpetuating suffering. He made clear that any future relationship between them must be predicated on Trent's acceptance of responsibility for past actions and commitment to reformed business practices. And he insisted that Trent withdraw permanently from active management of his companies, allowing younger and hopefully more ethical leadership to guide them forward. Marcus Trent, broken by the exposure of his practices and shattered by the knowledge that he had nearly killed his own son-in-law and might have harmed his beloved daughter, accepted these terms with something approaching relief. He had lost his reputation, seen his empire dismantled, and faced the abyss of criminal prosecution. The mercy Evander offered, limited though it was, represented salvation from complete destruction. The scandal that had consumed both families gradually faded as London society found new subjects for gossip and condemnation. The Northridge name, tarnished by association with Trent, slowly recovered as Evander demonstrated that he had married not for money, but for more complex motives that society could understand, even if it could not entirely approve. Annalise, who had been barely tolerated as Trent's daughter, found herself gradually accepted as Lady Northridge, a marchioness who had proven her loyalty to her husband's family while maintaining compassion for her father. The Tun, ever pragmatic, concluded that the match had turned out better than expected. A wealthy industrialist's daughter had brought her Marquis not only money, but also steadfast devotion when he needed it most. An aristocrat known for cold calculation had revealed himself capable of self-sacrifice and love. If the path to their happiness had been unconventional and marked by scandal, well, that simply made their story more interesting than the usual run of society matches. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and Evander, finally recovered in body, though still healing in spirit, suggested they return to Northridge Hall. London held too many painful memories, and he found himself longing for the wild beauty of Northumberland and the peace it offered. Annalise agreed, eager to return to the place where she had first begun to understand her husband, and where they might now build something genuine from the ruins of deception. The Dowager Marchioness, witnessing the transformation in her son and his marriage, unbent sufficiently to welcome Annalise with warmer courtesy. She would never be effusive, would never forget that Annalise was Marcus Trent's daughter, but she acknowledged that the young woman had proven herself worthy of the sterling name through actions rather than breeding. Eleanor, who had maintained cautious friendship with Annalise throughout the crisis, allowed that warmth to deepen into genuine sisterly affection. At Northridge Hall, surrounded by the family and staff who had gradually accepted her, Annalise discovered she was carrying the child conceived during those dark months when she and Evander had been locked in their separate sorrows. The news transformed her husband's remaining darkness into something approaching joy. He had believed himself incapable of such feeling, had thought his capacity for happiness destroyed along with his father's life. But the prospect of a child, of new life emerging from the wreckage of the old, gave him hope he had not dared to embrace. They named their son Thomas after Evander's father, a choice that represented not dwelling in the past, but honoring it while moving forward. The child would inherit both the Sterling title and the Trent fortune, would bridge the worlds of old aristocracy and new wealth in his very person. Through him, the sins of the fathers would not be perpetuated, but transformed into something better. Marcus Trent, invited to meet his grandson, came north for the christening, a changed man. Retirement had forced him to confront truths he had spent decades avoiding, and the brush with tragedy had broken through his pride. He could not undo the harm he had caused, could not restore the elder Lord Northridge to life, or erase the suffering he had inflicted. But he could, and did, establish funds to compensate families he had wronged, reform the labor practices in the companies that still bore his name, and dedicate his remaining years to repairing rather than continuing to damage. The meeting between Evander and his father-in-law, observed by the whole household with anxious attention, proved stiff and uncomfortable, but ultimately successful. Both men bore scars too deep to heal completely, but they managed courtesy if not warmth. For Annalise's sake, for Thomas's sake, for the sake of the future rather than the past, they declared truce, if not peace. Summer settled over Northumberland with unusual warmth, painting the moors in purple heather and golden gorse. Annalise, walking through the gardens of Northridge Hall with her son sleeping in her arms and her husband at her side, reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment. She had been married as a pawn in her father's ambitions and her husband's revenge. She had endured months of cold indifference from a man who saw her as merely instrumental to his purposes. She had suffered the revelation of deception, the heartbreak of unrequited love, and the terror of nearly losing her husband to violence born of the very revenge he had so carefully orchestrated. Yet from all that suffering had emerged something neither she nor Evander had anticipated. Genuine partnership forged in fire, love earned rather than easily given, respect built on weathering storms together rather than avoiding them. Their marriage, which had begun as a lie, had been transformed into something far more valuable than the conventional matches society celebrated. They had chosen each other not once in the thoughtless romance of courtship, but repeatedly in the far more difficult circumstances of disillusionment and crisis. Evander, who had spent years believing his capacity for love had died with his father, discovered that the human heart possessed remarkable resilience. He would never forget what Marcus Trent had done to his family, would never completely forgive the harm inflicted, but he had learned that carrying hatred poisoned the bearer more thoroughly than the target, that vengeance ultimately destroyed everyone it touched, and that choosing mercy required greater strength than choosing retribution. He looked at his wife, at the child she held, at the estate stretching around them, and felt something he had not experienced since his father's death. Satisfaction that was not dependent on someone else's suffering. Joy that did not require another's sorrow. Annalise had given him these gifts through her stubborn refusal to accept his darkness, her insistence on seeing the wounded man beneath the vengeful exterior, and her willingness to stand by him even when he gave her every reason to abandon him. In the evening, after Thomas had been settled in the nursery under the watchful care of his devoted nurse, Evander and Annalise walked together to the ruined tower, where Eleanor had first revealed the truth about their family's shared history. They stood looking out over the darkening moors, and Evander did something he had never done in all their months together. He apologized. He apologized for using her, for deceiving her, for treating her as less than the remarkable woman she was. He apologized for the pain he had caused her, for the months of coldness and deliberate cruelty, for nearly destroying them both in pursuit of revenge that had ultimately meant nothing compared to her worth. He could not undo the harm, could not reclaim the time they had wasted in misery, but he could acknowledge his guilt and commit himself to being the husband she deserved. Annalise, who had long ago forgiven him, accepted his words with tears and embrace. She admitted her own failings, her naive blindness to her father's faults, her initial inability to see the complexity of the situation that had consumed both families. She confessed that she had been, in her own way, as blind as Evander, seeing only what she wanted to see rather than confronting difficult truths. They stood together as darkness fell over Northumberland, two people who had every reason to remain strangers or enemies, but who had instead chosen the far more difficult path toward actual intimacy. Their love had not sprung fully formed from romantic first encounters or providential compatibility. It had been earned through suffering, tested through crisis, and ultimately proven genuine through sacrifice. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the bitterest hatred and the most calculated revenge. The human capacity for growth and redemption exceeds our capacity for destruction if we possess the courage to choose differently than our wounds demand. Lord and Lady Northridge had found each other not despite the darkness of their beginning, but in some ways because of it, for adversity had forced them to become people worthy of the love they now shared. The little boy sleeping in his nursery would grow up in a house where forgiveness had triumphed over vengeance, where the sins of the fathers had been acknowledged but not perpetuated, where love had proven stronger than hate. He would inherit not just titles and fortune, but something far more valuable. Parents who had learned through bitter experience that destroying one's enemies ultimately destroys oneself, and that choosing mercy and love requires greater courage than choosing revenge. Thus ended the chronicle of a marriage begun in deception and nearly destroyed by retribution, transformed at last into genuine partnership through the most dangerous power in all creation. A love willing to sacrifice everything, even life itself, for the beloved. Society would remember the scandal, but those who truly knew would remember instead the triumph, the victory not of one family over another, but of hope over despair, of forgiveness over vengeance, of love over every force that opposed it.